We had a ton of fun traveling pretty much all over the place from New York City all the way to Acadia, Maine, both by land and on the water. But now I'm ready to edit these photos. So in this video, I'm going to take you through my backup process from SD card all the way to the cloud. And then I'm also going to go through some edits that I have here on my computer. I picked about 4 or 5 photos that I think are my favorite from this entire series. And stick around for the end of the video because I'm going to show you how to go about printing your photo, and I'm going to print one of these selections myself for my own wall. So let's get into it. First things first, anyone who knows me knows that I love talking about backing up your photos and videos because you're out there getting these incredible shots. You want to make sure that you have them for generations to come. So from your SD card, I won't format my SD card until I know that all of my photos and videos are backed up to at least 2 to 3 locations. That includes, SD card, 2 backup drives, and eventually the cloud. So when I take my files off the SD card, they're first going to a drive like this, and then from there they might go on to my home NAS. And sometimes if I'm on the road and can't immediately upload to that NAS, I'll also duplicate these drives. And if you have a friend, you can always give one of the drives to your friend so that you know that it's in 2 different locations should anything happen to one of them. Also, if I'm in a place that has reasonable internet, hotel Wi-Fi sometimes does the job, maybe not all the time though. I will actually use Backblaze to make sure that automatically all of my photos are being uploaded to my account, and I know that all my photos on the shoot are constantly backed up to the cloud. Once I confirm that they're backed up to multiple locations, then I'm ready to format my cards for the next shoot. But usually I try and keep that as long as possible and use different SD cards until I'm completely comfortable and even have edited the photos. To duplicate a drive like this, I could hook up 2 different drives to one computer, and I'll use a program like Free File Sync, which is completely free, and it'll completely replicate all the files on one of the drives. And this is really helpful because it automatically syncs and I don't have to pick out one file each time. Once I'm completely done with a photo or video project, I take those files off of this drive and then it goes onto my NAS, where it also lives on the cloud as well. So I make sure that I completely back it up in multiple locations as well as having it on a RAID NAS. Now that we have our photos completely backed up, we can sleep a little bit better at night and we're ready to start editing our photos. So this was difficult to pick some selections. I picked around 4 to 5 images, and to start off I have maybe more of a simple one in comparison to some of the other birds that we photographed. This is a hairy woodpecker. We saw this actually around the same time that we were photographing owls, which was an incredible experience. This little guy was making some noise off on the left, doing what all woodpeckers do, and it caught my attention. It looked beautiful in the light, and the foliage in the background definitely stood out. So this was one of my first selections, and I was a little bit far at first, so I put on the 1.25 teleconverter on the 150 to 400 OM system lens. He wasn't moving too much, so I was able to get away with a 1/320th of a second shutter, and my ISO was fairly high at 4000. However, I'm not really noticing any noise in this image. I'm sure if I zoom in enough, there will be some, but overall, a very clean image, and I'm pretty stoked about it. I also love this angle because there's a little bit more of that iconic orange hairy woodpecker on his head that shows on this angle, so I like that much better. Anyways, let's jump into some minor edits that I would make to this photo just right off the bat. So I'm not going to mess around with the framing that much. I actually really like the way this was center framed. I am going to adjust the angle a little bit more. And then I'm going to use the masking subject tool to automatically pick the subject. You can see there were a few errors and it selected some of the wood here. A little bit hard to differentiate exactly what the viewer wants or the editor wants. And from there, I'm going to raise the exposure on the woodpecker a little bit. I'm also going to raise the exposure of the overall image just slightly. And then I'm going to zoom in on the woodpecker to bring out some of the details on some of the darker parts of its body. So there's a few black areas that are a little too dark to make out in the image. So I'm just going to bring up those shadows just slightly. And then I'm going to try and make its eye stand out a little bit more as well by using the brush tool, making it nice and small, selecting just the eye, and bringing up that exposure just slightly. And then once I brought up that exposure, you could see that catch light from the sky in the top of the eye. So I'm going to add a little bit to that by selecting an even smaller brush tool and then bringing that up. So as I was zooming in a little bit more there, I did notice a little bit of noise. So we'll handle that later at the end of this edit. We'll use the built-in Adobe denoise tool, and it's actually going to clean this image right up. From there, I want to draw a little bit more attention by using a linear mask to the woodpecker. So I'm going to bring that on the left side of the image and bring down the exposure here, and also include that wood piece. Now that I'm looking at it, it looks like it could use a little bit of warmth overall to better represent what this scene was like. So I'm bringing the white balance slider a little bit more to the warmer side to try and warm up the image just a little bit. And I also added just a hint of magenta. I'm going to add a little bit more on the lower exposure on the left side here, just to try and draw more attention to the bird. That's basically the goal of most of these masks, where I'm bringing the exposure down in certain areas, and it kind of localizes the contrast just slightly more so that I could draw the viewer's attention to the bird, and especially to the bird's eye, which is another reason why vignettes tend to be very popular. And I'm going to actually do that here, coming down to the effects area and add a slight vignette with a very serious feather, just to kind of draw viewers into the eye a little bit more. And then I'm going to come to the color area here, and this is where some of the more fun stuff tends to happen. But you can get a little crazy here, so be careful. I'm going to push the green saturation just slightly on the saturation and the HSL slider, and then come to luminance, and I tend to like those a little bit on the darker side. And I'm also going to bring the yellow luminance up just slightly. I'm going to bring the orange saturation up just slightly to bring out its head, the color on its head a little bit more, but I'm going to reduce the saturation on this piece of wood so that it doesn't distract from the bird at all. So just adding a quick brush to the piece of wood, and I'm going to drag down the saturation. I'm going to reduce the clarity just a few in the negative area, because it just gives a little bit more of a ethereal sort of vibe, so to speak. And then I'm going to scroll down to the denoise area and the detail area in general. I'm going to experiment with the denoise section here for a little bit. We're going to use Adobe's denoise AI that tends to have some really great results. Then I'm going to add a little bit of sharpness back and make sure that that sharpness is completely masked, however. And that's our final result for the hairy woodpecker. I'm really stoked with how this turned out. And even shooting at 4000 ISO on a Micro Four Thirds sensor, it crushed this image, so I'm stoked. I think we're ready for the next one. One really important note before we start editing here is that and I need to heed my own advice, because we're in a very bright cabin on a lake here. So we didn't have a very dark editing room, which would be more ideal if you're editing. You want to have as neutral of a space as possible. If you can, use a color calibrator. We have those on the B&H website, and those are fantastic to make sure that your screen or monitor is completely calibrated. These MacBooks tend to be pretty well. They do a really good job at color calibration overall, but brightness, they're very, very bright, so you may want to dim it down to around 50%. Different devices are going to handle your photos and videos as well completely differently, so that's where those ICC profiles that we'll talk about later in this video come into hand. However, you just want to try looking at photos on different platforms, and we'll talk a little bit about how you can better understand what your final print will look like if you do choose to print your photos. These next edits, I promise I'm going to try and make a little bit quicker, but we have an Atlantic puffin here, and I was so stoked to be able to see them in person, so pretty close, but especially when I threw on the 2x teleconverter, this brought us even closer, and still getting incredible detail on this camera, so I'm very stoked about that. First things first, I like the framing of this, but I want to crop in even closer, because it is an Atlantic puffin overall. However, I love the water around the puffin, so I don't want to completely, crop in, one, because of resolution, and two, because I want to include that water in the photo. I think it's very important. So I still want to maintain that center framing. I'm keeping that in place. Right off the bat, I want to bring out the puffin a little bit more. So I'm going to actually use one of these adaptive subject filters, and I'm going to apply the pop one. I think it just helps bring that puffin out a little bit more. And like I was saying in that last photo, we want to draw all the attention to the main subject, and your eye immediately goes to the main subject in a center composed image like this. To enhance that even more, I'm actually going to add a little bit of a radial gradient that is inverted to affect the rest of the image aside from the puffin here. And what I want to do is add a little bit more clarity around the puffin without affecting the puffin, because that would make it look a little too digital around the puffin, and I want the puffin to look more ethereal as opposed to the water surrounding it. And I'm also going to bring down the exposure, which inherently adds a little bit of a vignette around the puffin, drawing your attention in towards the middle even more. I'm going to bring down those shadows a little bit, and then I'm good on that radial gradient. I'm also going to add a linear gradient on the left side here to kind of enhance the lighting just slightly. Give it a little bit more contrasty lighting. I'm going to bring the exposure down just slightly and also add a little bit of a blue tint. As you can see, I'm not adding a whole ton there. On the right side, I'm also going to do the polar opposite, and I'm going to add a little bit of a brighter exposure on the right and a slight warm tint, but not extreme in any way. And I need to feather that out quite a bit more. From there, I'm going to add slightly more contrast to the photo. And I'm happy with that result. I would have loved to have been even closer to the puffin, but overall this image I think is a really fun way to capture it in the water. All right, for this next one, we've got a great blue heron, something that I love to photograph. I think I love those bigger birds in general, but a great blue heron is one of the most majestic birds in my opinion. And we actually saw this one from a pretty great distance. And it was very hazy out, so we were shooting through some serious fog. There was a ton of atmosphere between us and the heron, and I still think we got some great resolution, and this lens resolved this photo in a fantastic way. Even zooming in, there's so much detail. I'm very impressed with it. I would have loved to have gotten a little bit more eye level with the great blue heron, but I still think it's cool to show those patterns in the background with the grass all behind there. And the other adjustment that I probably would have made when photographing this is I would have showed this water on the right. There was a little water feature, and I would have loved to have that in frame a little bit more. Also, I added some foreground with this foliage here, but it is a little too shallow depth of field to even make out that it is foliage. So first things first, I'm going to bring up that foliage in terms of exposure here. So we're going to start with that, just to kind of identify that that's what that greenery is, and it's not like a dark mask of any sort. Next, this was a very foggy day. I want to add a little bit of haze to the background. So what I'm going to do is a linear gradient, and I'm going to subtract our subject from that linear gradient. So I'm going to click subtract, select subject, and it needs to be tweaked a little bit more. So I'm just going to add back some of this because it didn't properly detect it exactly. And then I'm going to raise the exposure back there just slightly, and then add a little bit of haze here, and just slight amount of contrast. Conversely, I'm going to do the exact opposite thing to our foreground, and I'm going to just duplicate and invert the mask. It makes it super simple. However, I don't want the subject darkened as a result of this. So if I were to, actually it looks quite nice. Maybe I will keep that. I'm darkening the foreground quite a bit here, except I'm going to subtract again because I don't want to affect this foliage here. And I'm going to add even more of a darker mask on the left side here. And then I'm going to use this adaptive subject filter to select the blue, select the great blue heron and give it a little bit of a pop. And I'm gonna, again, just fix that up a little bit because it selected too much of our scene. And it is a great blue heron after all, so I'm going to add back just a little bit of blue and up the saturation even more here. It kind of makes the great blue heron stand out in a very, let's say, more dreary atmosphere, which is what it was actually in. And because it was such a hazy day, I'm going to add back a little bit of the dehaze feature and also just a hair of clarity. And then from there, I want to bring up the greens just slightly and bring down their luminance a little bit as well, but bring up that yellow. Then I'm going to come down and also add a little bit of a vignette. We've got birds chirping out in the window here. Gotta love Maine, man. This helps to draw our attention to that great blue heron. And then I'm going to add a linear gradient on the right side here again. I tend to be a very left to right sort of person. It's how we read. I love to film in left and right as well. I'm going to subtract a linear gradient to subtract this foreground element. Raise the exposure just slightly and add a little bit of warmth just to bring a little bit of sun, I guess, in to what is otherwise a very dreary day. Then I'm going to come back here to reduce this exposure some more. And the last thing I'm going to do here is actually remove this somewhat of a distracting. I don't know if it's a bird or a little stick, whatever it is. It's a little distracting, so I'm going to just use the stamp tool to get rid of that, and I'm going to feather that out a little bit more. And I'm pretty stoked about that result. So that was the before. The before was a little bit more cold, and I think we added a little bit more warmth. We brought out the great blue heron quite a bit here, and also better represented how it looked on this gloomy but still very beautiful day. I was in between this owl image and one other, but I landed on this one because I just think, you know, it's classic kind of, it's almost like a school portrait for an owl. And we have a beautiful barred owl that we had this amazing experience with in Acadia, and this was one of my favorites that we walked away with. Just an incredible experience overall. So this raw file is completely, I'm very impressed with how sharp this entire file is, and we shot it at 1000 ISO, barely any noise. The bokeh in the background is rendered so beautifully on, I think I was using the 40-150 at 2.8, so just one of my favorite images of this trip so far. So first things first, let's brighten this face on the owl a little bit here. And then we're going to bring down the background by creating a mask, select background. We're just going to bring down the exposure in the back there just slightly and increase the contrast quite a bit. This just helps isolate and separate luminance from the background and the foreground, and helps to direct some more attention to that. We're also going to bring up the saturation slightly in the background as well, and add just a little bit of warmth back there as well. I'm going to add a linear gradient here on the bottom left to kind of add to the shadow that's on the bottom of its feathers here, of the wings here, and just bring down that exposure just slightly. And conversely, like I've done in a few of the other photos, I'm going to actually add to the sun that was just beautiful on the top of the owl here, and add a little bit of just like perfect. And then I'm going to zoom into the eyes quite a bit here to accentuate this catch light in its eyes. And while we're here, nice and zoomed in, all up in this barred owl's business, we're also going to add a little bit of saturation and slight exposure, a brighter exposure to its nose or beak. We're gonna add some contrast to the overall image and warm it up just a hair. And this image is very, very high when it comes to clarity, just naturally. It resolved beautifully, and I love the detail, but I'm gonna bring down the clarity just a hair to make it feel a little bit more ethereal, and then also bump up the vibrance just a hair. I'm coming down to the HSL slider now to mess with some of these beautiful adjustments, and I'm bringing the greens over a little bit to this end, as well as the yellows. I want to bring out a little bit more. Bringing down the greens in saturation and bringing up the yellows just slightly. And I'm going to enhance this one mask that's bringing down the exposure of the bottom left half of the image, mainly to draw a little bit more attention to the top half. I'm going to also add a slight vignette. And I'm also on the top half one. I love this bokeh so much that I want to bring it out just slightly more, so I dehazed it just a hair. And I'm very happy with that more neutral, like natural owl edit. I think this is beautiful. All right, I had to grab some coffee for this final edit. Really stoked about this one, and interestingly enough, I think this one needs the least when it comes to editing. Not that any of them really needed that much. So first things first, I'm going to add a little bit of a radial gradient here, because for some reason there seemed to be a slight shadow casted around this area, so I'm just going to brighten that up a little bit. And I'm going to brighten this area of the overall image up even more later in this edit. Actually, why not do it now? We'll do it live. So I'm going to add a slight linear gradient here, and we're going to raise the exposure. Oh, and by the way, this image, I'm especially stoked because it's diving, I believe, to grab a shrimp, and it's like falling out of its mouth, and he catches it again. It's just super cool to see. Any chance that I can get to capture the behavior of a bird like this, I think is generally ends up being one of my favorite photos because of it. And we also have a slight island in the background, so you get some of the atmosphere as well. It's not just water. I'm going to add a linear gradient to the bottom of the image here, just to add some natural contrast. And let's see what we got here. Oh, that looks sick. It's interesting too when you're editing your images, and if you eventually post things online and you make a carousel or something like that, I've noticed that other people's images that are their favorites tend to be so different than what mine is. Mine, you know, if I see a big bear, that's going to be my favorite image, but someone else's might be something a little bit more interesting or peculiar. So I always love finding out what other people's favorite images are as well. Continuing in that same line of thinking, let's also add a slight vignette to this image so that we can get more attention drawn to this bird. However, so this was a pretty foggy day as well, so I want to enhance the fog in the background, and what I'm going to do is subtract our subject here, which is the bird, and Lightroom absolutely crushed it with that mask just now. So I did the linear gradient and subtracted the subject, which was the Arctic tern, and then I'm also going to add a little bit of haze to the background. Ooh, that looks good. And then I think the whole image could use slightly more contrast and a brighter exposure. Last but not least, I'm also going to do a subject mask. Again, Lightroom absolutely crushed it. And I'm just going to brighten the Arctic tern up a little bit and add a little bit of saturation here. And I think that's it. I'm stoked about this. I think it looks natural. We didn't do a crazy amount. There was already sort of it almost looked like the Arctic tern at first was completely in darkness. So we inverted that and made the light coming from the Arctic tern, and I think that is much more appealing to see. We didn't do any crazy filtering in terms of the colors here. I do, however, like this SP11 one, and you know, initially right off the bat it comes on way too strong, so you want to dial that back to around 25, 30, really whatever suits your interest. All right, now it's time to talk about printing. And one of the most important things about printing, we touched a little bit on it before was you want to make sure that you're in a neutral environment. This is not that neutral of an environment. It's a lake house cabin in Acadia. So something a little bit darker, and if I were to darken my screen to about 0.5%, that would be much better for when you're getting ready to actually print your photos. So one way to ensure color consistency across multiple different devices, and for the device that you're going to print to, if you're printing to a very specific printer and to a specific format like a particular type of paper, is to use what is called ICC profiles. Adobe has one already built into Lightroom that really has a wide range of compatibility. It covers a huge color space. If you know what print house you're going to use for your print, you can check and see if they have ICC profiles to download, like this one print house that I had actually found on their website. They have ICC profiles and they're a very reputable source for printing. So in Lightroom, to load that up, we go to soft proofing. There's actually multiple ways, but this is one of the ways. And then under profile here, actually this is it right here, but let me show you where that is. There's a few options here, and I actually just downloaded them. And you can see there's a wide range of companies that have ICC profiles for a bunch of different things. This is just one of them, and they offer ICC profiles specifically for these types of prints as well. So on luster format, and as you can see, they're also 16 by 20 and larger, so for those sorts of prints. So if I load that up and I turn on, you can see the difference right away. So basically that's trying to emulate exactly what your print more or less is going to look like, so that you can make those adjustments in Lightroom before actually sending it out to print. You know, we all have that thing where we send a print out every once in a while and perhaps it looks way different. That could be because of the different color spaces. It could also be because maybe the screen that you're editing on is either not calibrated or it's just too bright. These MacBook screens are very bright, so again, try and dim that down and edit in a neutral space. And depending on what platform you're printing to or what format you're printing to, also a lot of prints aren't exactly additive. If you're printing on a canvas, then it's going to look much darker than if you're printing on something like metal or even acrylic or even some glossy prints. So that's something to keep in mind as well, and that's where you should check to see if the print house that you're printing to has ICC profiles, and then you can adjust based on that. So from there, I'm going to go into my export settings, and then JPEG, we want to make sure that we're at 100%. If the print house accepts TIFFs, that would be even better, and quality obviously at 100 as well. You can keep it in sRGB or even Adobe RGB. And scrolling down to image sizing, I have the resolution at 300. And I like to turn on the sharpen for the specific type of paper that I'm printing to. So if I'm doing matte paper, I'll just keep it in standard. I'm planning to do glossy paper though, so I like to just keep it in standard for the most part. And that's pretty much it. I just click export and it's good to go. And this is the result. We had such an incredible time from New York City all the way up in Acadia, Maine, exploring the beautiful landscapes that this place has to offer and all the beautiful wildlife that also inhabit this place, and especially the wide variety of birds that we had the great opportunity to photograph. From the boat to the land, this place offers so much, especially in the way of photographic opportunities. And I highly recommend that everybody get outdoors to photograph birds in any capacity that they can. But I hope this series helped you, maybe even inspired you to go outside and photograph birds. If it did, let me know in the comments below. Let me know what your favorite bird to photograph is. I would love to hear it. Thanks to B&H for this series, and thanks to OM Systems as well. My name is Matt, and I'll see you next time.